Morning, good morning, good morning. That's all the Matthew McConaughey references I'm going to do today. So I'm James Kidd. I'm a partner in the employment team at Mills Reeve, and I'm joined by...
I'm David D'Souza. I'm Membership Director at the CIPD.
And I love our first comment that says you two are such a double act, which is, it's all downhill from here, I'm afraid. But so, housekeeping, and then we'll probably get started. So welcome, thank you very much for joining us. This is the first in our series of webinars where we're looking at the effect of COVID in the workplace. There's another 4 coming up from next week is looking at COVID in immigration, and then we're looking at remote working, and then the disproportionate effect of COVID on women and others, and that's at the end of May. So today we're trying to look at, okay, what is a return to the workplace, not a return to work, which is what some of the headlines look at, although obviously a lot of people have been on furlough. And David and I are going to do this without the aid of slides, so it's slightly uncomfortable for me as a lawyer. There's nothing else on screen apart from us. So housekeeping, please raise some questions in the Q&A and we'll have a look at those as we go through. We'll hopefully finish about 10:45 with time for a few questions. This is being recorded. When we get to the end, there'll be a pop-up in your browser which will ask you to give us some feedback, and it'd be lovely if you could say some great things about David's cardigan, okay? And if you don't like his cardigan, don't say anything. Fair?
I'm not sure it's fair for me, but yes. I don't, and Davinia's just said yes, so I don't know if she's answering the question of yes to the cardigan or yes to fairness.
I don't know. Right. So we have a loose structure of how we're going to do this. So we're going to look at where we are now. We're going to look at some surveys. We're going to look at what a return to the workplace is going to be like, and there's 3 obvious permutations of that. We're going to look at the issues arising from that. We're going to look at how we're going to return and what we've learned so far, and then a bit of Mystic Meg gazing into the future, which is how I put this to David. Would you come and be Mystic Meg originally? For those of you who have no idea who Mystic Meg is, Google is your friend. Okay, I'm waiting for David to get his crystal ball out. No. Okay.
I've got a glass. That's the best I'm going to manage. So
that'll do. Fine.
I feel like I haven't prepped now that I haven't got a crystal ball to hand.
Fine. So judging by the opening, this is how this is going to go. Basically, I'll put out the zingers and David will look blankly at me. Is that how it works? Excellent.
Sorry, I was looking blankly. I was just trying to get into that rhythm. Yeah, I've got that down pat.
Right, serious face now, David. Come on. Yeah. We need to do
it.
So reflections on the current position. Where are we now? Well, where are we now is, as you can see from our backgrounds, neither of us are in the office. And so we are adhering to current government guidance, which, as I understand it, is we should all be working from home where possible, unless there are mental or physical well-being issues, or it is particularly challenging to be working from home. So we're in accordance with government guidance, but we're looking to the future, aren't we? So we know that under the roadmap, 21st June is the big date where we might have the great unlocking, and we might have a great influx back into the workplace. But there's some issues there, aren't there, David? What do you think about social distancing? Is there going to be any social distancing, or are we going to be let loose?
I think it very much depends on who you listen to, and it will depend on the risk appetite of organisations as well, and potentially the geography. So are people travelling by public transport? Are people able to get to work under their own steam? I think the government still hasn't published its guidance, and the timeline is actually in June for that review of kind of COVID secure workplaces and social distancing within them. So there's an extra bit of information that we're all waiting for. But I'm hoping, as everyone is, that we get back to normal life as soon as possible. There are obviously commentators and scientists saying that it may take a little bit longer.
Okay. And then we have CSC, which I didn't know was an accepted abbreviation until I looked it up. COVID status certification, apologies, which they're saying, well, it might be rolled out in care homes, might be in hospitality, but there was no mention in the, I think, 6th of April report from the government that they'd be looking at CSC in the workplace, which is interesting in itself. So, which I think probably would be, because there's no one wants to spend millions on a new app to make that work. because you're going to lose your little vaccination card.
Yeah, and I think the challenge will actually be this winter. So we're probably, for a number of reasons, summer and autumn will be safer, hopefully. But actually this winter, does everyone have to get revaccinated will be a kind of question there. But also, if a peak picks up, what state will we go back to?
Yeah, indeed. And I guess it's also about the combination of testing, contact tracing, and vaccination, and how that's all going to play out. So if we are traveling positively, that was easy for me to say, traveling positively, and we're looking to June and the great unlocking, where are we going to be? So I look at some of the surveys of what various institutions and companies have found out by asking people, and we all know what happens if you ask people in the street. You get an interesting answer, or you get lies, damn lies, and statistics, which will be interesting. So I'm going to bombard you with some statistics now, and David's going to react on the spot to what they mean. So he's my live pundit. You normally should be in an outside broadcast somewhere, pointlessly. So KPMG looked at 500 CEOs from 11 countries, including the UK. Their key findings were a third of those CEOs believe we'll have a return to normal in 2021. That's a third. Half of them thought it would be a return to normality, whatever that might be, in 2022. But a quarter of them said their business has changed forever, but didn't say whether that was for good or for bad. So interesting. Any comment on that, Mr. D'Souza?
Yeah, certainly. I think CEO sentiment survey is always really interesting because it depends on quite often the positivity and optimism of the CEOs, and their job is quite often to convince people that things are going to be okay. So I think they've been throughout quite positive and quite bullish about how quickly we can get back. I think the interesting thing over time will be the interplay between different organizations. So if you have some organizations offering flexible working, offering remote or hybrid working, what will that mean for the organizations that don't offer that? Yeah. And in fact, will they have to change their practices in response to a fundamental change in the market that's been triggered by this?
Okay, and we'll come back to that in a bit more detail. So YouGov did a survey of 1,039, odd number, workers. The majority said they wanted to return to work largely as before. 31% they wanted to return to work exactly as before. So a relatively small sample of only 1,000 people, but interesting, clear steer of actually, I want to go back to February 2020.
And it's nostalgia, because I think we want the world to go back to how it was in February 2020. I think if you'd have asked people in February 2020, most people would have said they would have liked their work to change. We've not had that. And the thought of going back to a nice buzzy office or a place where actually the world feels safe and secure and you know what's happening is really attractive. So I think it's dangerous to judge people's sentiment at this space and time, just because the world's changed so much. But 70% of the people in that obviously would like some change at the very least.
Yes, indeed. And I think it would have been different. It depends on when you ask, whether it was 3 months in, 6 months in, a year in, and how you've adapted or not adapted to the whole breaking a chair. Careful. So ONS, Office of National Statistics, said only 46% of people were working from home at the point of survey in 2020, with a third of them working fewer business hours than normal, but the majority of people couldn't work, and that was because the majority of people were on furlough. So the stat I got was something like 8.7 million people were on furlough at its over the entirety of furlough, and obviously it still continues. That's a lot. I won't ask you to comment on that. On McKinsey, 80% of people enjoyed working from home. So, it's very high, and 69% of them said, I am as productive or more productive because I am working from home. As we'll see later, actually, productivity is an interesting measure here. And is that just because you're working longer, or are you working more effectively? We'll look at that. I think that's probably enough on stats. Anything else on where we are now, David, before we move on?
No, the only thing I'd kind of say again is that people have been locked in a really artificial situation. Asking them about their sentiment doesn't reflect how the world's going to be going forward. So we know from the travel stats and things like that what has happened, what has changed. As soon as you start saying how's it going to look in a year, you need to think about the interconnection of things and the interplay of things and the fact that for most of us, we've just been excited to see people. So the thought of going back to a working environment where there are people that aren't my family, who I love dearly, is a really attractive one. But actually, when you can socialise with your family and things like that, does it change? So pinch of salt for most of the stats, and always worth thinking about for some of the organisations, their affiliations in terms of, do they own land estate, real estate that will be impacted by trying to encourage people back? Just putting that out there.
Wow, that's a touch of cynicism in there.
You've been able to see it really clearly in the headlines playing out. So we interviewed a large real estate organisation, and they said it's imperative for the country to get back to the cities, versus we interviewed a rural organisation that said we just need better infrastructure and broadband, or a town centre that would require, would like actually people not to be commuting and supporting local business. There's a perspective and funding behind all of this.
Okay, if you did agree or disagree with anything that we say, put it in the Q&A and we'll pick it up, unless it's violently disagree, in which case we'll ignore it, obviously. Not really. So David has already touched on the opportunities. So there's three, aren't there, really? So we're all going to go back to the workplace and it will be like before. We're all going to stay working from home, David on his lovely leather couch, or there's going to be a hybrid, and he's already touched on that and referenced that. And so we're just going to go into those in a bit more detail. Should we do that? We can go through those in order.
Yeah, that makes sense. Order's a wonderful thing.
So if we all went back to the office or the workplace or the organisation or whatever it might be, leaving aside the whole issue of whether there will be social distancing, we run the risk, David, don't we, of losing some of the great things that have come out of the last 12 months.
Yeah, you don't even run the risk. You sort of lock in the previous state that we had. And we know that for many people, work just wasn't working. So whether that's from the point of view of inclusion, diversity, fairness within the workplace, all of those things which are fundamental inequities in work and in society, we're saying we'd like to go back to that. Now, there are some people that benefited from that and would like to go back to that. And there will be other people that were desperate for that system to change. So everything's been thrown up. We've got a chance to decide where it comes back down, or some agency over that. And we need to make sure that we don't go back to some lazy defaults, some of which were set in the Industrial Revolution. So things around working hours and expectations, they're not based around the best way to do work now, but they've been conventions that we've picked up and stuck to over the years. They were never going to change rapidly unless something externally came along and broke them. That's happened. It would be stupid to try and put it back together the way it was.
Okay, I think we've got David's view there quite clearly. He doesn't want us to go ferreting around underneath the loom anymore from the Industrial Revolution times. Okay, but if you're the CEO of Goldman Sachs, though, he sees working from home as an aberration, and he wants everyone back.
So there's a couple of things there, which is that for some of the traditional professional services organisations or FS, their model has been historically very much around you learn from the person next to you, you're very much in that environment. I can understand their desire to get people back. What we could really do with those organisations doing is putting more effort into finding the flexibility they have in the system. It shouldn't just be everyone in or everyone out. Should be based around the role, should be based around the need, should be based around what the organisation needs as well.
Okay, if an organisation were to say, I want everyone back, there's going to be some of those lost opportunities, aren't there? But there's also going to be some people who are saying, I don't think it's secure. I think the employer should be able to reassure people in terms of making the workplace secure if they go through the usual health and safety stuff. But B, we might get some pushback of, actually, I don't want to do that. I'm going to put a flexible working request in. And therefore, that will be an interesting time for the employer, won't it?
Yeah, I think it could be a busy few years in terms of case law, just because if you've been able to prove that you can do your work effectively from a home environment, the rationale for the employer needing you back will probably need to be quite strong. I mean, it need to be a legitimate business reason. And it will be hard to see how that would manifest in different ways. But I think real estate plays a big piece of that. Which organisations are renting, which organisations own, will play a big part actually in how senior teams make these decisions. because you wouldn't want to sell in a depressed market. That will impact probably the way that you think about working.
Good point. And also whether you want to de-size or whatever the word is, to reduce your footprint.
I think right sizing is the way that it was referred to a few years ago, wasn't it? Yeah, but yes.
So I picked up in preparation for this that the government is proposing a public consultation late summer, early autumn on reform of flexible working. Have you heard of this?
Yes. So Peter Cheese, who's our CEO, is actually head of the flexible working task force. So we're involved in that at the moment. And we would, there are a few changes we'd like to see, one of which is the introduction of the right to people to request flexible working from day one. But actually, probably looking at workplace and construct of work is probably more important now than it ever has been. So I think that's an incredible opportunity for us to think about work, how it sits and how it should be.
Did that come out of the original promises from Theresa May when she was PM, or is this a new drive?
There's been an extension of the task force. We've been calling around flexible working for a long time, but Peter's been head of that for some time now.
Okay, so I wonder whether your point about extension from instead of being 26-week right, it becomes a day one right, possible extension from employees to employees and workers, which would be interesting. Making it not just a permanent change, so more ad hoc, so it's building in more flexibility, as the name suggests, and then perhaps moving to that presumption that it will be granted unless there are, I won't swear, very good reasons why the employer says no. And just to pick up on your point earlier, that goes back to that issue of, can I do my job properly, all of my job, from home or not? And you then start straying into those slightly ephemeral categories, that's a good word for this time of the morning, I can do the majority of my job at home, but can I develop other people? Can I do those bits which require more collaboration, more social contact? And that becomes much harder, doesn't it?
Yeah, so, and it does come back to job design and looking at that in the round. So there are organizations that have worked successfully purely remotely for years and been very successful doing that. It can be done. They still develop their people. They still get them, involved in the culture. They still collaborate effectively. Sometimes they collaborate brilliantly. Quite often they're in the knowledge management or tech sectors. And I think there are some really legitimate questions, sector by sector, role by role, around that blend. And that's why actually it's not just what's the organization stance on flexible working. It's about, look, for that role, for that group of people, what's the best balance between the individual and the organization? So I think you're right that we've probably broken the assumption that working from home is somehow less good. That's been a long time coming, but it doesn't mean that for every single role it's going to be the best way of executing that role. But equally, there'll be some lazy assumptions that stuff can only be done in the office, which we know isn't the case. So
Agreed.
It's going to be complex and we'll have to work it out, but organizations should start from a point of flexibility, but then work it through into the practicalities.
Okay. Wasn't it, it was IBM, wasn't it, that 400,000 people work for IBM. They put 150,000 of them, said, right, you all work from home. And then, I love this, 8 years later, so it was a very long experiment, 8 years later said, this is a disaster. I read that it was a plummeting productivity, which is, quite a strong adjective. And then said, right, everyone back in. So, but that was a few years ago. So one would hope that they've learned from that and would be able to say, actually, we could look at that and do it differently.
Yeah, and quite often these things either come in, I've been doing this a long time, they either come in cycles or they're related to a CEO's preference. Just being really practical. So you're not doing particularly well, so you say everyone can work flexibly. And then you reach another period where you're not doing particularly well and you go, well, the root cause must be that we allowed them to do that. So there's a slightly faulty cause and effect. And the other thing is, it's not just IBM, several organizations have done that, but lots of organizations will be doing something the other way. I think consistently reviewing the way that you're working, the way that work flows and where people do that in terms of location and technology, really sensible thing to do. But I think what tends to happen is you get these bold proclamations, everybody out, everybody in. And that's not subtle enough to deal with the different work types that people have. Or it might be that you need to be in the office a bit more for a longer period because of a project or because of the time of year, all of those things. We need to have enough flexibility to just say, look, today, where's the best place for you to be? And does that work in terms of the whole as well as your own individual preference?
This all sounds incredibly sensible. Some employers, though, are not going to look at it like that, are they? It's going to be all out or in. You know, we used to talk for years about the dinosaur manager, the one that wouldn't trust his or her staff to be able to work effectively out of sight. Do you think those dinosaurs have been educated and the meteorite has hit, or do you think that there's a risk that they're still around?
Well, that's exciting. Educating them, then hitting them with the meteors. That's really over the top. I think you can see it in some of the way people approach it. If you came through, I guess, the business educational system in the 80s and 90s, you were led to believe that your charisma, your presence was what was driving productivity. That's not the case. There are enough studies to show that, but those people are now running organizations, and that's the proven success kind of formula that they built their careers on. So actually it's quite challenging to have someone say, actually, that wasn't all about you. That was actually about the work getting done there. No, they're definitely still out there. Some will have changed their minds and been pleasantly surprised. Some will have enjoyed working from home themselves, and therefore they will go, well, if it works for me, it should work for other people. But actually, to your point, I think there'll be a challenge with some of those people working in organisations in pockets. So a team gets treated very differently, and that's been the case for years. You can have an organisation with a flexible working policy, but somehow that team over there needs to be in the entire day. And some of it, as I say, it will fluctuate between CEOs because there's so much personal preference that goes into how a CEO puts their impact on an organisation.
And in terms of culture, there's a real issue of we've been talking around this, but if all stay working from home, or the reality, which is we're going to be in a hybrid, aren't we? But if we're in a hybrid, there's going to be some real issues about how does the organization retain its culture. We hear so much about these are our values. We've had them beautifully scripted in lovely font calligraphy in the wall behind reception, and it's wonderful. We've done more than that. We've put them out to everybody, and we've got everyone to sign up to these wonderful vision, and this is our mission statement, all that sort of stuff. But actually, if everyone is working from home, how do organizations make sure that everybody is buying into that and living by those statements, and therefore it doesn't adversely affect their culture?
I think it's one of those things. Values should be seen in the manifestation of people's work, not just their ability to recite them. And I've worked with organisations. My favourite thing is the poster, which is the posters that you get on the back of the toilet doors, where you can't even take a toilet break without the values being there, whilst you're attempting to reflect on other things. So we know that actually that's not the best way of manifesting values. They come through the leadership, the collaboration, the decisions the organisation makes about its customers. Those things are what we need to focus on, not can we get you in the office environment and create a kind of monoculture where everyone feels and operates the same. So you should have greater space, and it's a really complicated thing, but for diversity of thought and opinion, that would be great if organisations, are bold enough to say, look, we have values, they're the things that we stand for, but you can manifest them in different ways. So it shouldn't be that you have an incoherent organizational culture. It should be that you have a more variable one, but with the same sense of purpose and the same deliverables.
Okay. Pausing there, I understand that the live transcript is putting up some interesting translations. So Peter Cheese comes out as pizza cheese. So hi, I'm sure
I'm meeting him later. I will have that conversation with him, and I'm sure he'll be delighted. And I can see, I think this is a really important point. I kind of touched on it with sectors. People talk about organizations as if they're one thing doing one thing, because quite often they kind of deliver there. But you'll have sectors where there's a mix of employees, head office, and needing to be on site. So how you treat head office will be very different. You'll have things like manufacturing where absolutely there might be more expectation, more jealousy, more resentment of head office and the flexibility that you have there. versus the experience externally. And I think one of the things organizations need to resist is, because lots of them are now investing in their offices in a different way, creating collaborative workspaces, all those things, it'll be really difficult to reconcile improving the head office experience without doing it for frontline workers in parallel. I'm seeing that already from organisations. We can't afford to give everyone a pay rise, but we can afford to have a nice office for you to come back to. And if you're the average employee, I can't see those two things stacking up particularly well in terms of feeling that you're being looked after. So I think one of the things from the last year is a greater sense of fairness, people wanting that and that coming from work. And that could be support in the benefits system for people who haven't been able to work, things like furlough, but the expectation seems to be changing and shifting in terms of that balance of relationship. And I think that will be really interesting to follow over the next 6 to 12 months.
Okay, I really like that. That's really good. One person says, I'm interested in David's comment that it's not charisma that drives productivity. Could David possibly comment on what does?
Yeah, certainly. Lots of work gets done in the system. So it's the way that you set up the work and the workflow throughout it. There's actually quite a bit of work and research around the notion of trust and how important that is, particularly in knowledge organisations. And what that says is actually there's something around consistency. I'd rather work for a boss that is consistent and I know what they want and they kind of push that. I think we reduced leadership to this kind of notion of, that kind of commander before a battle giving an inspiring speech. That gets the work done some of the time. I'm not anti-charisma, but actually what we too often do is promote people in organisations who are confident and maybe articulate, but actually don't have the skill sets that you actually need day in, day out around organisation. Some things that are more boring, seemingly, but actually really make a matter to people. So do you make good judgment decisions has got nothing to do with your level of charisma. Critical to an organisation. I'd rather have someone quiet and effectively making really good decisions than someone able to captivate a room who's going out and ruining the company every time they make a difficult call. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on that one.
So basically you don't want Henry V to be your CEO?
No, for a number of reasons on that one, but yes.
Fair enough. Okay. If we allow hybrid working, does the contract of employment have to state one principal work location? If so, what happens if it is half the time at home, half in the office? I probably should take that one. You're right. We need to change the contract of employment and to bake in that flexibility. And there are tax issues about where the person's principal office is going to be for expenses and potentially where they are in the world. Come to one of our later webinars to look at that. So the short answer is be upfront. But I'm not in favour of the prescriptiveness, and I think David would probably agree with this. This is all about actually, rather than, you've got to be Monday and Tuesday here and Thursday and Friday there, let's have a greater degree of flexibility. However, and I'll bring you in on this, David, isn't it work? There's a tension here, isn't it, between what is right for the individual and what is right for the organisation. So the individual wants some certainty where they're going to be, and like a routine. The organisation will want some certainty that everyone's going to be together on certain days, perhaps, and fundamentally the work is going to get done. So a degree of allowance, perhaps, is a good idea.
Yeah, I think if you start off saying you can be as flexible as possible, you might not end up with people in the right place at the right time. So I think organisations are going to have to find their own rhythms based around the workload. The worst case scenario, if I'm sitting on a senior team at the moment, the worst case scenario is 3 days a week where people are in the office and they need to be socially distanced because then my office is at peak capacity and more, and then everyone else wanting equipment at home as well. Because from a P&L point of view, that's really, really challenging. So there are myriad considerations that go into this, but one of them is just simply cost and square footage and all of those calculations. But yes, I think changing the office from the default to the place that you go to collaborate or do specific pieces of work will be a really important step for many organisations, because it's that once you get that psychological kind of shift from I go to work each day because that's what I do, in a physical location, to actually where do I need to be today to best get the work done. That's a maturing of that relationship and thinking process.
But that requires a large degree of strong, good communication from your good leader, not inspirational leader, and people believe that change is going to be affected in that respect, isn't there?
Yeah, and line managers are key in that. So, we talked about the CEO earlier, but actually quite often it's your immediate environment. So the organization at team level, how often are we going to meet? What's that look like? How do you get the social support that you need so you feel welcome and you build that trust? How do we collaborate effectively, and how do I flex as much as I can to support your lifestyle? Different organizations will come to a different determination on that.
Yeah. Okay. Lots of questions. I'll come back to those in a minute. Let's just look at the hybrid model, which is probably where we're going to be, isn't it? And in terms of, there's a real risk of a them and us culture developing more if it's already there, where the people who are in the office get the great opportunities for the great work. They might get the great promotions because they're visible. It's presenteeism. We're back to that. Whereas the people who are brilliantly working from home, either some of the time or not, just aren't getting that. And we talked about this, and I won't rip out what you're about to say, but it's something about baking in and avoiding those problems and learning from companies and organizations that have already come to grips with that.
Yeah, and organizations need to specifically design for inclusion. And I'm seeing quite a few organizations going, 90% of our people want to do this or that. That final 10% are quite often the people who got a raw deal before and are going to get a raw deal after if they just go with the 90. So there's been some really good analysis recently, actually, of home workers and how they've been treated relative to peers in offices over time. And they tend to get promoted less often, and they tend to also receive a lower bonus, or are less likely to get a bonus. That's something that we should fix. Otherwise, what you're going to find is, particularly as we still live in a society where the preponderance of childcare duties still fall primarily upon women, that it will be women that are more likely to request and need flexible working, that will put them outside of quite often the eye line of the senior management team, and could potentially impact career opportunities and also impact their pay. Now, what you don't want is to go, well, okay, women need to go back into the office, which is, I've seen someone say that already. We need to solve for that by making sure that, no, you should have the flex, but what you need is to really judge people on their outcome, not the social capital that they build, not the reputation that they have, not the fact you had a really good chat with them in between meetings, and create a level playing field for talent.
Wow. Okay. I think that I can see that a lot of consultants going, okay, I can help organizations do that, but actually, surely there's going to be, and no disrespect to any consultants on this, the embedded HR people already should be looking at how do we design our processes and our organization now fit for the future. One of the things that we talked about previously was whatever you do for the next 6-12 months is probably going to change going beyond that, because everything is in such a state of flux.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important that organizations aren't averse to experimenting, but you need to be really open and transparent. And that takes a different type of leadership. So for a leader to turn around after 6 months and go, look, we've been trying this and it's not been working, we're going to go and try something else. That's better than locking in something that's dysfunctional, but it does require parking your ego for long enough to go, I made a bleeper, or I operated with the best information that I had at the time, and we're all trying to solve this problem in the right way. But yeah, organizations have to monitor for some of the things that could go wrong, because you don't want to end up in 2 years' time and find out that every promotion that you've made has been for the wrong reasons.
Sorry, apologies. Go on.
No, you go on. Sorry.
So part of that is perhaps, I liked your point, which is that actually it's not one size fits all. So this part of the organisation, we need this type of work being undertaken. That could be in the office. This team does this type of work, so therefore they could be majority working from home, but come together as necessary. So it's working out and doing the assessment of what does the organisation need, how is that best going to work, but it's also perhaps doing trials. So rather than just doing everything for everyone to start with, let's do a trial and see actually how effective is this new world going to be.
I'm happy to share my failure, because I think it's always important for people to get. So when the pandemic first started, we shifted everything with my team to pretty much the same routines that we had before, but doing it online, and it didn't work, and they got fatigued. So what we said is that we'll keep the meetings really punchy, and we'll just scripted objectives, bang off the call. If we can do a 2-hour meeting in 20 minutes, we'll do that. And then what we found is after a couple of months of that, the social fabric wasn't there. So people were feeling that work was completely transactional. So we had to go, right, okay, that bit's working in terms of the pace, but we're going to have to find other ways to connect as human beings and kind of, make sure that we still feel like a team in a community. That required me going, that's not working. Is it working for you? That's not working. We tried to fix it. It's still not working. Is it working for you? And keep doing that. Now, doing that at an organizational level can be challenging, but actually, if you are prepared to give some of that authority to the line managers and trust them a bit more and require of them a bit more, I think there's probably more flex in the system than most organizations would naturally write into a policy. But the only other thing I'd say is to your point around contracts and expectations. If you had work that required travel, you'd normally have expected in a JD that to say you might be away from home 12 days a year, or it might be 2 months that you'll be required to be kind of away. It's that kind of thing where I think you can set broad principles and expectations for people, which is this job might be 40% in the office, 60% out.
Yeah, agreed. I do think there's a trust issue, there's the trialing issues, but it's also how are we going to work together to make this work? Whether that's pulse surveys to talk to people to find out, and you continually update them. So it's communication, isn't it? There's a lot of that. Let's move on. I think we've done a lot of that already. Did you want to talk anything about the social capital and the social network, or do you think we've covered that already?
I'll just say that that's a large amount quite often of promotions and how people are viewed in an organisation. And we need to make sure that just because people aren't having lunch together, that doesn't result in a different way of their contribution to the organisation being viewed. I think that's a hugely, hugely big challenge for organisations, that they value the people that are in front of them. And the more proximate you are to someone, the more likely it is that you're going to survive a redundancy round, get a pay rise, get a promotion. That can't be something that continues to be baked into the system. Yeah.
Okay. But equally, how do we replicate the water cooler moments? Did you watch Line of Duty last night? How do we do that when we're in a hybrid?
I think you designed for it. I think that's fine. So we've known a host of organisations that, and people that, where they're running quizzes, those kind of things, you can do that. But equally, meeting up socially, on a regular basis, saying, look, whatever happens, we're going to be in the office, 1 day a month together, but we're not going to talk work. We're going to try and do those bits. And also, it's not impossible to connect with people. I think it's harder to meet people online, by video, but you can do that as well. And I'll say, there are some organisations that have been doing it for years, and Basecamp have got some really good guidance actually on inducting people remotely. As an organisation, they publish that kind of open source so anyone can access it. It's possible. You just need to work a bit harder because it doesn't fall in your lap, because they don't come to the office on the first day, so you don't meet them naturally there. So you don't go, do you fancy grabbing a bite to eat after work? You just need to go, well, they'll be missing that. So it's my job as a leader or an organisation to try and fill in that gap.
Okay, I do believe, I love all of that, but I do believe there needs to be some baseline, so there is consistency. So you've got not line manager here who is on those messages, gets all that, and then there's line manager over here who is more restrictive, is perhaps an apt word. Quite what the live transcript says of that, I don't know, or makes of that. So we'll see. But so actually, the organisation needs to be setting some ground rules as to guidance to managers, whatever, to make
completely.
sure.
And that's where it comes down to HR resisting the desire to kind of policy everything to the nth degree, but setting really clear guidelines and principles as to how the organisation works. So if it's not looking and feeling like this, we'd like to hear from you.
Okay. I blinded you all with stats earlier, but I just wanted to share something here, which was that in the US, somebody called ProdoScore, whatever the live transcript makes of that, said that average start times, January 2020, I think it was, were 8:24 in the morning. And that became 7:46 in the morning. So that's a much earlier start by 40 minutes. And then the finish time went from 5:30 1 p.m. to 6:12 p.m. So a 40-minute later end time. So we're seeing whether that's just the effect of everybody being forced to work from home, a sudden extension of the workday, but query whether actually that's there are bits where you go off and do the hoovering, vacuum cleaning, other hoovers are available, or whether you're walking the dog or whatever you might be doing. It's not whether other hoovers are available, is it? And I don't work for the BBC, so hey.
The legal challenge coming here.
Yes, suddenly became very sensitive to that. So, but that to me is interesting, and so there's a huge piece, isn't there, about resilience, being able to work within your normal hours, or you've set and said to your employer, or you have your contract with your employer that says, I'm going to get the work done, but I'm going to do it at these times which suit me, and it's all about outcomes, which is what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, so I think we're at a really interesting time. There are a few things, and I'll rattle through them so that we have time for other bits, but there are a few things going on there. One, people aren't psychologically secure because the economy is in a downturn, so they're going to put in more hours to try and kind of work in that way. Secondly, there are lots of organizations really struggling, so the requirement of people is probably going, up higher than it might be. Thirdly, we know from a bank of research that extending the working hours doesn't necessarily make people more productive and has other societal ills. So you wouldn't want to bake that in longer term. And fourthly, the organisation's got responsibility to look for that from a duty of care perspective, but also in terms of the actual productivity. It's not the best way to work. There's a question around the 4-day working week. And I think a more flexible working week is probably the aspiration. But to your point, more give and take in the working week and more flexible is probably healthy. More give and more taking just by the employer is probably really unhelpful. And I'll hark back to my days doing employee engagement, where the aspiration was apparently more discretionary effort. And it's like, okay, so that's just more hours for no more money. I can see why the organisation would want that. I'm not entirely sure it's healthy for the individual. So there's a range of things going on.
Okay. We were going to talk, I think, about trust, and you told me about, was it a French company or was it a UK company that were installing the cameras? And I certainly heard about the people aren't allowed to eat at their desks, and they feel that they don't get as many breaks. So whether that's a continuation of working from home or the hybrid model, there's some employers are, I won't say abusing, because I think that's wrong, because there might be genuine good occupational reasons why they need to operate in that way, but having the camera on the whole time and feeling that you are on display, is that the right word? It's obviously has a psychological effect for the employees, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's hugely invasive. So I think from the taking an ethical viewpoint on it, employers should be attempting to minimise the amount of invasion of people's homes that they have and the amount of monitoring that they do of people. So broadly, providing people with performance information that enables them to get better at their jobs, healthy thing, and technology can enable that. Ensuring effective checks and balances for security, etc. That absolutely makes sense. At the point, you're essentially attempting to run a modern kind of industrial mill. It's really unhealthy. We're going back hundreds of years. We're just doing it with fancier tech, and that's a really unhealthy thing. It's not healthy for the individuals, and it's a business model that doesn't make it a good business model.
Okay. Nice hark back to the Industrial Revolution comment earlier. Very good. So if we were to sum up, and then we'll take some of the remaining questions, what do you think the key takeaways of planning for the future in terms of returning to the workplace would be?
I think for me, it's experimentation, it's consultation and voice. It's ensuring that just because it works for the majority of people, that you're designing something that works more broadly. I think it's an acceptance that the world will continue changing and finding its own new equilibrium. And it doesn't really matter actually how many of us would like it to change or how many would like it to stay the same. It's going to do that because of market forces and people's expectations. And then I think I'll come back to that point of, principles and finding a way through rather than policy. Because policy sets out kind of clear expectations in some ways, but it doesn't work well with complex things that manifest in different manners, because every individual is different, and quite often the construct of work is different. So I'm really hopeful about what comes next, because many people have wanted change for a long time, and a tragic external event has triggered a genuine evaluation of what we're doing. You don't want to flip back to where you were, but equally, you don't want to fully commit to how things will be different, because we're still exploring and learning.
So HR are in a key place, aren't they, to be able to assist those organisations to get the best out of the people, but work with the people to be able to get the best out of the situation.
Yeah, it's been a horrific year for us as a species and as different communities, but the HR profession has come out of this genuinely showing its worth. And there'll be stories about bad examples, but what I'm hearing from CEOs, what I'm hearing from people is that actually the level of technical expertise plus compassion has seen HR operating right across the piece. That gives us genuinely a voice in how this stuff's shaped next. We're critical to doing it well, but we have to make sure that we're thinking things through rather than going reflexively. The world's moving at pace, but actually just taking a little bit of extra time to go, what are the consequences of us doing this? Just because I saw a headline in a magazine, does that mean it's right for this organization? It's really critical. So that evidence base, you starting with stats, is a brilliant place. What's really happened? What do we actually know is happening next? And if so, what are the possibilities, and where do we want to weave in a more positive world?
And talking to the staff, communication, and all that. And I'm guessing there's quite a lot of resources available from CIPD to help busy HR professionals.
Yeah, we've got a dedicated coronavirus hub, which has been seen by millions. Beyond that, we are starting to build that out into the kind of return to workplace piece as well, in terms of guidance. We've got a specific research guide on what works well in terms of flexible working and in terms of remote working. So if you're looking to genuinely see how it works in different organisations, there's some case studies, which I know someone mentioned, that's the place to go.
Brilliant. All right. I'm just going to wrap that bit up and say thank you, David. Let's just do some questions. We're planning to allow our staff a blend of home office working from June 21st, assuming the roadmap allows us to do so. What's our obligation to provide equipment for the home environment? That's a legal question. You don't have to pay for a desk, a chair. You only get into that sort of stuff if there are disability in play and you're into reasonable adjustments. The flip side of that is, if you want your people to be as productive as possible, think very carefully about their home setup and whether that's going to work, and also about ergonomic risk assessments and making sure people are doing those, recording those, so that actually you're not just letting people hunched over a laptop and storing up PI claims or potential PI claims for the future. So another one, what do we think about workplaces asking staff to go back to work before the government advice to work from home where possible ends? Employees are feeling apprehensive as to why this decision is being made and feel it's against current government guidelines. We're seeing quite a lot of that, actually, where people are saying, come back to work now. David, any views?
Yeah, follow the government guidelines. That doesn't mean that there can't be, and you mentioned some of them at the start, if you're doing it with a view to people's mental well-being, so you need to have some people back because actually their working environment doesn't work for them at home and it's causing them stress. That absolutely makes sense. If there's something that you can only get done in that working environment, that makes sense. Otherwise, if you really want people to come out on the other side of this feeling that you cared about them and saw it right through to the end, forcing them back when it's unnecessary really isn't healthy. And I'm seeing a lot and hearing a lot about that. And you can see the travel stats going up each week. There'll be a desire actually from people to get back and see their colleagues. That's really natural. But that shouldn't be a driving force for what we're doing now. Just follow the roadmap. That's the government advice. That's the best understanding of the science. And CEOs, the overlap between CEOs and epidemiologists is quite low.
And you don't want to be the headline of equivalent of some of the London people saying, right, everybody back, because actually that's just probably going to be naming and shaming.
Yeah, completely. Look, without getting overly dramatic, and everyone will have a different view of the level of risk here, as a senior leader of an organisation, your first duty of care is not to kill people. So whilst the government is saying, look, to keep everyone safe, this is what you should do and you can play a part in it, you need to have a really, really damn good reason not to be going along with that guidance.
Okay, you heard it from here. I love this one. Will employees working from home be entitled to the same perks as office workers? Hashtag free tea and coffee and toilet roll for all. If you, I think that's quite interesting, because that actually feeds into what we're hearing is certainly some of the London law firms are looking at this and saying, hey, you can work wherever, that's fine, but we're not going to pay you your London waiting anymore. So there's a price, i.e. a salary reduction to be working from home, because that will free up the office space, because potentially they can take less, and you are therefore less expensive, and you're saving because you don't have your season ticket thousands of pounds cost, whatever it is, per annum. So that's going to be interesting. So are you, as an employer, then going to go, well, I'll give you an allowance because I'm not paying as much tea and coffee and toilet roll. But that comes back to, should the employer be paying a contribution to the heating and lighting and Wi-Fi costs, which are going up? Some have and some haven't, haven't they? It's been a mixed bag.
Yeah, it's been hugely variable, and there's almost a, what lens do you apply to it? So I've seen employers go, look, you're better off with us working this way, so actually we're going to keep the money. And then I've seen employees going, I used to get free lunch, where's that free lunch now? And how does that show up? And I think it will be organisation to organisation. I think it will be incredibly different, but it's quite telling. I can speak to different people in different organisations, but they're from the same company, and they'll have different views on it. I think there's something quite personal about whether how you think that employment contract or psychological contract will work.
Okay, I'm going to say we're going to draw a line there, I think. Thank you, David. Enormous thanks. That's been brilliant, really helpful. I hope everyone's appreciated it and got something from that. I'm sorry we didn't answer all of the questions, but we said it was going to be about 45 minutes plus Q&A, so I'm going to call it there. Okay, everybody, thank you so much. There is a recording going to be available. I would all ask you to clap, David, now, and to say thank you very much. They all are, obviously. Look at that! David, you're a hero. So not all heroes wear capes. There you go. And look, you've got some...
It's been an absolute delight, genuinely. So thank you for so many people for joining us. And James, thank you for hosting and being so kind about everything apart from my cardigan.
I'm not mentioning a cardigan again. Thank you, everybody. We look forward to seeing you on the rest of the series. Do complete the feedback, which will pop up. And I will stop the recording now and say au revoir. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.